Today, I'm going to show you how you can generate dynamic OG images with the new Vercel OG library and Next.js. OG images are the images that you see when you share a website on, for example, Twitter, the preview it shows. Most of the time, the images you see there are static images and are not anything dynamic based on the page you're currently looking at. However, with this new library, it's actually pretty easy to create a custom image, which for example includes the page title or any other dynamic data on this page. And the nice thing about it, you can just write them with HTML and CSS. And if you want, even with Tailwind. We'll be having a look at this library by building these two example images. One that contains just a simple page title, and the other one actually similar to the GitHub images, showing, for example, the number of stargazers of a GitHub repository. Let's jump right in and see how you can build this for yourself. The first thing we have to do is create a new Next application by typing npx create next app. After running this command, npx created a new directory with the same name as the project name. So in my case, npx just created a directory called dynamic images, dynamic OG images. And in there, we actually have a new project set up with Nextjs. The other thing we need to do before we can get started is also install the Vercel library. As soon as that's installed, we can open up Visual Studio Code to start building something. The next step is to start our dev server by running yarn dev, which will start on localhost 3000. Opening that URL gives us the basic Next homepage you get when you, for the first time, install a new app. We are actually going to ignore all the pages because the way the Vercel generator works is actually by using the Next API routes. Next API routes can be used for creating real APIs, but in this case, instead of JSON, it can also return an image. And this image is actually what's then shown as a social image. Next API routes can be found inside the pages directory. By default, it ships with a hello world API route, which we're actually going to delete right now. Inside this API directory, we can create our own file called, for example, ogimage.tsx. And inside this file, we can build our own custom API. After we've created this new API file, the first thing we need to do is import the image response class from the library. Another important thing to note is that we need to export a config object from our API endpoint. In this config object, we define a custom runtime for this function. In this case, it's the experimental edge runtime. This means that our code is actually not executed at the origin, at the server where our code is hosted, but at the edge, which means somewhere really close to the user in the CDN usually. Most of the times when you heard about a CDN, you've probably heard it in combination with some sort of static asset caching. For example, caching of images or any other HTML or JavaScript assets. The main reason CDNs are usually used for these kind of things is because they are located really close to the user. And that actually helps in serving these files as fast as possible to the user. That has, of course, the result that the web page will load faster. With the edge runtime, we now also have the option to run a little bit of JavaScript code on this edge as well. So this means that we can execute JavaScript functions also really close to the user, again, resulting in super fast response times. In this case, Vercel decided to build this in a way that it only works as an edge function. That means that specifying this runtime is really important. I'll make sure to also link a great article by Netlify about these edge runtimes in the description as well. But the most important thing to know for now is that the edge runtime actually has a little bit less features than Node usually has. And that's the reason why if you would run this in a normal Node environment, this would not work. So if you're going to host this API route anywhere, it's really important to check if your host also supports these edge functions. For example, Netlify and Vercel both do support this, but it's wise to check if your host does as well before building anything around it. Now that's out of the way, let's start building this API. The basic API routes in Next work in a way that you define a handler function. Next expects this handler function as a default export. And inside that handler function, you can actually return strings, JSON, or even images as long as you set the correct headers. Inside this API handler, we can return a new image by returning a new instance of the image response class we have just imported. And as an argument of this class, we can pass any JSX string in here. So we could simply add a div with hello world in here. In this case, The image response class takes care of turning the JSX into a real image and also making sure that it sends the right headers to let the browser know that it's getting an image and not, for example, JSON. If we go back to our app, we can go to the route/API/OG image, where this again maps to the name of the file we created. By opening this link, we actually see that we already have an image with the text hello world. By hovering the image response class in our editor, we can also see the type definition of it. This also shows us that there is a second argument we can actually pass to this class, which contains options. In these options, we can pass a width and a height for the images if we would want to. The OG image generator already says a width of 1200 pixels and a height of 600, which is the most common size for any OG image. So for now, we are going to ignore this, but know that you can also change these dimensions if you want to. The first image we're going to create is the image Vercel actually uses on their own website. It looks like this. On the left side, you see a title of the page, and on the right side, you see an illustration. For now, we are going to assume that this image on the right side is always the same, and that we only change the title on the left side. For styling these images, we can actually use two different options. We can either use an inline style object, which you would use normally in React, that would look like this. But the other option actually is by using Tailwind. By default, the library also supports the TW attribute, where you can pass pretty much every Tailwind class name. That's what we're going to use for now, because personally, I really like writing Tailwind class names. Let's go back to the example image first, and then we'll start with creating a basic structure for this image. There's probably two columns inside this image if we think in HTML structures. There's a left column and a right column. If we are going to view this image right now, we will see an error. That is, that it actually does not support all the CSS features you're used to. What it's doing behind the scenes is actually converting this HTML into an SVG and that converting to an image. Because of that, they need to manually implement all of the CSS features that they want to support. In this case, that means that they've implemented display flags, and display none means you have to set that on any element that has more than one child nodes. So in this case, that means that we need to add the flags class name to this first wrapper div. If we've done that and we refresh the page, we see that we have the image again with both the left and right column. Next step is making two columns. For now, we will just stick with both of them being half. Because I couldn't find the source image of this prism, I actually found another really nice Vercel prism image, which is this one. So we're going to diverge a little bit from the original design. First thing we're going to do is add in this image. The next thing you notice if we add this image in is that again it will break. And the reason is because it cannot parse this image URL. In order to render images, it's important to always use the full URL. So probably if you're running this on multiple environments, you might want to put this in some sort of environment variable. For now, I'm going to add this in a separate variable in this file called website URL. Oh, and now we're actually again seeing that it's complaining about the display flags. As soon as we've linked the right URL, it will show the image. Let's make it full width and full height. Now we don't see anything anymore. The hard thing about this is in contrary to working in a browser, there is not really a way to inspect this right now. The library does have a debug option actually. So the thing probably is that we need to make this a full height. Same goes for this. Then we see the images again. Let's disable this for now. Who knows, we might need it again. Okay, the next step is actually to add the title on the left side. We can use HTML tags, but it's not really important to use the right heading levels because this will render an image eventually. So no one will see this HTML. But for now, let's stick to using normal headings. Title, building an interactive WebGL experience in Next.js. Oh, it's lowercase js actually. And we're also going to add this subtitle as a paragraph. If you did not see this prism, definitely look it up. It's a really cool 3D prism with a lot of the lights you see in this image as well bouncing off. Really well done. Here we go again. Display flags. I told you. Flags. Right. So now we want to have this as a flex column because it needs to be underneath each other. And it probably also makes sense to add like some padding on this. Yeah, perhaps 6. Good enough for now. All of these properties I'm actually using from Tailwind, the 2XL, for example, are the defaults you can find in the Tailwind CSS documentation. So if you go to text size, font size, yeah, of course. All these defaults are you're actually able to use. You can also use the new arbitrary values in Tailwind, which actually work with square brackets, where you can, for example, say 80 pixels, and that should also reflect. Yeah, that makes it huge. Okay, let's stick with 52 for now. Right, let's give this a background color. That makes sense. This thing is not full height. Yep, and then probably text color white. Oh, it actually looks nice if we can push it to the bottom instead of the top. So that makes that we have to remove this full height and then add a margin top of auto, which will then push it down. And in that case, the color is gone, of course. We can add it actually to the full div as a background. And then we can remove it here because why have duplicate properties that doesn't do anything? Will only confuse people. Okay, getting a bit closer. Let's make this padding also an arbitrary value because I don't like these defaults in the design 48s. The next thing we're actually still missing is having this scoot line on here as well. So let's do that next. There's multiple ways to do this in CSS, of course. Usually I'm not a big fan of having empty HTML elements that don't do anything except adding some styles. But since in this case, there's no browser that's ever going to use this HTML, let alone a real user, let's just stick with that for now. We can add div in here. Let's see, we just make it red. Let's see how that turns out. Of course, a full red square. Make it absolute. Let's leave it red for now because that way we can easily debug. It should maybe be 30 pixels. I'm trying to make like a line that we're going to skew. Okay. Then we need to, of course, say left 0, top 0. Nope. All right. It's, of course, positioned underneath the image now. Let's move it underneath the image. There we go. Now, one thing I noticed when experimenting with this a little bit is that the rotate property of Tailwind is actually unknown. Like I said, they support a lot, but not everything. So sometimes you need to resort to using the inline style object. So always look at your logs to make sure that this is not the reason why it's not updating. We can just combine both Tailwind and the style property as well if we want to. Let's add a transform, rotate 45 degrees probably. Ah, that's way too much. 12 degrees, something like that. Okay, and that means that it might need to get a bit bigger and it probably should go further to the left. If we want to do negative properties, again, we can use the arbitrary value. Yep, make it a little bit bigger. Also needs to be a bit higher. Okay, and now it's bigger. We just need to move it a little bit further to the top. And now if we make it the exact same color as the background, it should probably disappear. The only thing that could potentially be an issue is what happens if this text, like you already see it a little bit, is a little bit longer, then it will get cut off because this overlaps actually the left side. I think an easy fix for that could be if we simply add the z-index, and that also means that we need to make it position relative, otherwise the z-index won't do anything. Let's see. If we make this again, background red, I have the feeling that it's actually has something to do with that it renders this line as a fully separate object that's actually not part of this wrapper div anymore because it converts it to SVG. So we could try to reverse this for now. Move it to this side. Okay. And if we then say flags row reverse, what it will do, because it swaps them now in order, is it will keep the second element as the top element, because usually that's the way HTML works. It stacks everything on top of each other that comes after each other. And in this case, this thing still comes after the other column, even though we then reverse them. So this way we can actually leverage the fact that the right side now lies actually underneath it because it's earlier in the DOM. So that actually means that if we now remove the debug lines again, you see that it's actually nicely overlaying instead of getting cut off. Okay, already looking quite similar. So there's two things missing right now still. One thing we probably want to do is be able to make this thing dynamic. In order to do that, we need to be able to read data from the URL's query parameters. You can use the request argument to get any data from the URL. If we add this argument in, we can read the search parameters from the URL. With these search params, we actually can call a get method, like Copilot is already suggesting here, to extract something from the URL. So if we say search params.get title, it will actually try to extract that from the URL. So if we convert this into title, title is my fancy title, and we log this, you actually see that we get my fancy title. So the next step would be to just render out this title here, and that's nice. Only thing you need to make sure of is if we pass a full string in here, it's not a valid URL. It needs to encode the spaces and any other things that are in the URL. So in order to have this title including spaces, it's actually important that you wrap this, for example, encode URI component, which will actually encode spaces and any other invalid URL characters into characters that are valid in the URL. So if we copy this and add this in the URL, you see that we get the nice title again. We can, of course, also do that for a description. Copilot, thank you again. Then we also need to encode this piece and paste that in as well. Of course, we do need to render it, even though it looks like it worked, but it did not, I tell you. Because if we break this now, then there should be nothing. So that's working. Always test if you can break it as well. So that's good. Now, actually, we kind of have a fully dynamic image URL. You can just take this URL and add it as a meta tag with property, is OG image, and then the content of this URL where you just build out the string with the title and description, and you can generate everything you want. The only thing missing still, if we look at the design, is probably a bit better font because we're still using default. If we look at their docs, you can actually find how to load the fonts as well. What we need to do is make sure that we import them and pass them as options to the image response options. So let's quickly do that. So in the meantime, I went to Google Fonts and found the Inter font there and downloaded both the medium and the regular variant. The next step is to load both of these fonts. Change the path to public fonts intermedium, and we call this intermedium, as well as regular. And after that, we need to await the font data inside the handler. Wait intermedium and regular font data. The next step is adding a config object to the image response as well, which accepts an array of different fonts, where we can add font data, medium font data, as well as the font weight. And instead of font data, it should simply be data. Same goes for weight. And we're actually also going to do this for the regular 400 regular font data. And now we've actually loaded both fonts. Since we're only using one font, at least one font name, this will become the default in the full image. So there's no need to really specify the font itself. So if we refresh now, you already see that we already have the new font. Let's still do a few more tweaks to really make sure that it looks like a design. I think it should be a little bit smaller and the text color is a bit more grayish of the bottom text. This looks really good. Now we know how we can render images with data that's coming from a query parameter. I actually want to take it one more step further. I want to build an image that is actually similar to the GitHub images. These images show data like the name of the repository, but also, for example, the number of stars it currently has and the number of forks. I think we can build something like this pretty easily by only as an input of our API giving the name of the repository and then fetching all this data via GitHub's API. To start, let's just make a new API specifically for GitHub by copying the old code we had. I'm going to remove everything that's in here for now. Let's leave in the flags because we'll probably need that again. Facebook/React. For the search parameters, we only actually need the repository name, which we will call repository name. And I will also leave in the fonts. For now, we will just use the same font. If we go to this new URL, it will probably still be a little bit of a boring image. But already it says Facebook React, but that's not coming from the URL yet. Let's quickly fix that as well. Repository Facebook/React, and then we need to replace that here as well. And then we don't see anything, which is probably because this slash is also a character that you cannot use in a URL. If we use the encode URI component again, let's see what we get. Yes, we indeed get something different. Now it's still not working. Let's see if I made a typo as well. Okay, here we go. Let's first create a basic layout, how this would look. We're gonna make this 2 columns again. And then the second column for now will only contain the logo. Let's make this an H1. And then we have some intro text, which we will get from the API. And finally, we have statistics. Okay, next step probably is adding flags again to all these divs. Flags call. This is also a flags call, right? Oh, this is actually flags row because the logo should be on the right, yes. Then we add some padding. In this case, the text should be 98 pixels. Oh, it's text, not font. We make this 48 pixels and we add a width in here. Yeah. The question also becomes, if we revert this quickly, what would happen if you had a very long name? Because currently, if we enable the debug mode for a second, what you see is actually the column extends until here, but the text is overflowing because it's too long and it's not wrapping into a new line because it's one word. If there would be a space in the name, it would do that. So it's also a good thing to think what would happen if it was a really long repository name. For now, we are going to ignore that. You could think of different options, like maybe the font should be smaller. Maybe you dynamically make a smaller font depending on the number of characters. Maybe you add an ellipsis at the end. There's like different options for this. The only thing actually, while going back, I noticed is that of course this thing should be full width, and that already solved our problem for now, but towards the future you would still have that issue if you had a longer repository name. Let's make this a bit smaller, at least for now, and this as well. And then let me quickly pop in the different SVG icons. This is looking good enough to be able to fetch the data. GitHub actually has an open API you can use to get values like the number of stars of a repository. The URL of this API is api.github.com/repos and then the name of the repository. We can use that API actually to get all the data we need for this image. In the renderer of the image, we can already fetch the data and we can add the repository name we are currently requesting data for, which is the repository name we extract from the search parameters. If we fetch this and parse the JSON, we should be able to get the values from this repository. If you look in the console, you see that there's actually a lot of data, number of stargazers, watchers, and the number of open issues. So let's get the value from this object we need. So that means that we can actually pass this value into our component, forks, and the issues equal to the issues. and the stars is equal to the number of stars. If we refresh, we see actually that we have the correct value. For now, we won't do the formatting because that would take too much time, but you can imagine that you can really generate the exact same image that GitHub actually uses. The last thing I still want to do is show the right logo in the top. That will just make it look a little bit nicer. We can get that image from GitHub data owner.avatar URL, which we can then show instead of the word logo. If we now refresh, we should actually see the logo. And actually we get an error because since we added a comment, now this div has 2 children, so we need to add display flags again in here. By now refreshing, you see we have a logo. We only need to make sure that it has the right size. And of course, we still have to remove the old background color from the previous image. And when we've done that, we actually have something that's quite similar to the image GitHub renders. Of course, we didn't spend that much effort on adding in all these details. I hope these 2 examples showed you how you can create your own custom OG images based on data either coming from query parameters or even from other APIs or your local database. Being able to this easily create your own custom images will make your social images stand out. I hope you found this video useful. Make sure to check the links in the description as well, where I've also added the link to the code we just wrote. That is it for this one. Thank you very much for watching, and I see you in the next one.